Okay, we're live now, I believe. So I'm going to go ahead and just get started with the introduction. Um, and then if you can watch if anyone comes into the waiting room, I appreciate that. So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Geneva Blackmer. I'm the Interim Director for the Interfaith Center at Miami University. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization that seeks to unify people through relationship building, dialogue, and social action. The Interfaith Center at Miami University is located within the traditional homelands of the Maiamia and Shawnee people. The Miami people, whose name our university carries, were forcibly removed from these homelands in 1846. We encourage you to support the work of the Maiamia Center at Miami University, dedicated to restoring the revitalization of the Miami language and culture and to restoring that knowledge to the Maiamia people. This program is part of a virtual series which centers the theme of nonviolence and particularly compassionate interfaith responses to violent acts, be they personal or systemic. Today, we will explore how religion, and Christianity in particular, has perpetuated physical, psychological, theological, and spiritual violence against the queer community. To guide us through this conversation, I am very pleased to welcome the Reverend Dr. Ben Hilskamp, who is the Executive Director of Love Boldly, an Ohio faith-based nonprofit working to create spaces where LGBTQIA+ people can flourish in Christianity. They serve as the pastor of the Blue Ocean Faith Columbus, a small progressive Christian congregation in Columbus, Ohio. Ben is an active author, organizer, activist, and public theologian, a doting uncle and unapologetic Star Trek geek. If he ever got a tattoo, it would be of the Oxford comma. So, Dr. Hilskamp, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Geneva. And welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's my pleasure to be with you and to do this presentation today. I definitely want to thank Geneva and others who were registered for our earlier date. I had some family emergencies that came up, and I definitely appreciate the flexibility in rescheduling for today. My presentation today is titled We're Not Ashamed, American Christianity, Violence in the LGBTQIA+ community. I encourage you throughout the presentation, feel free to put questions in the comments or in the chat rather, and I will also leave time at the end for any questions. There we go. Before I get started, I want to be clear about some content warnings. We are going to be talking about violence. We're going to be talking about the intersection of violence with the LGBTQIA+ community, as well as both religious-based violence and religious trauma. I realize that in talking about these things, certain members of the queer community, certain members of religious communities, as well as others on this call, may feel triggered. I encourage you to take time for yourself, to take the space that you need. If you do feel triggered, or if anything we're talking about today brings up bad memories or your own legacy or shared legacy of trauma. Along those same lines, I want to note that I will be using LGBTQIA+, LGBTQ+, and queer interchangeably throughout this presentation. When I'm using any of those terms, I'm referring to a community that includes lesbian, gay, bisexual, pansexual, transgender, non-binary, queer, intersex, asexual, aromantic, two-spirit, polyamorous, and many other identities that have not made this acronym or any other acronym that exists within the queer community. I recognize and I acknowledge that the term queer has been reclaimed by many people in our community, but not by all. And I definitely acknowledge that there may be people on this call and are others who will never be able to associate queer positively either with our community or with their personal identities. For me, however, I use queer in both the academic context of queer theory and queer theology. I use it as what I feel is a better umbrella term for our community. And I also use it personally as one of my identities, where I identify as a queer man rather than a bisexual, gay, pansexual man. So I want to start by talking about a brief overview of Christianity and the LGBTQIA plus community. First off, there have always been queer Christians. Whether we're talking about members of congregations, ministers, pastors, priests, religious sisters, nuns, monks, others, there have always been queer Christians. Sometimes people, particularly more conservative folks, like to talk about how the queer community has, quote unquote, infiltrated the church. We did not infiltrate the church. We grew up in the church. More and more individual churches, denominations, and traditions have become more affirming, and more queer Christians have come out and claimed the identities of both queer and Christian. Far too often still, when we talk about the queer community in the church, we talk about queer Christians as if being queer or being LGBTQIA plus puts you in one identity group and Christian puts you in a separate identity group. You will often hear authors and public theologians and others talk about bridging the gap between the queer community and Christianity. I'm here to say that I am a queer Christian. I hold both of those identities as intersectional identities and as other identities that are part of who I am. Even 3 years ago, when I joined Love Boldly as the executive director, we were even still using this misnomer of there being two separate groups that needed to somehow come together. The fact of the matter is, just like any other identity that we hold those identities intersectionally. So we don't show up as just a queer person or just a Christian or just a member of another group, marginalized or otherwise. We show up as the totality of our identities at that intersection. Groups of Christians, as I think we all probably well know, have used the Bible to attack LGBTQIA plus people. I imagine that some folks on the call are, if not most, are familiar with what we call the Clobber verses. The Clobber verses are simply a group of usually about 7 or 8 verses and passages from the Christian Bible, sometimes a few more, sometimes a few less, that have been used to demonize, marginalize, and really convict the queer community, specifically queer Christians. Some of these are easily to quote for many of us: Leviticus 18, Leviticus 20, Romans 1, even sometimes Genesis 1. These are the passages that are trotted out time and time again to somehow attack the queer community. Also, particularly within the evangelical movement, the idea of being born again or born again language is often used when talking about queer people. The theory or the thought being that if Jesus or faith in Jesus can cause one to be born again, then queer people should be able to be born again and out of this quote unquote sin of homosexuality. That being said, however, properly interpreted in both the original language and the original context, the Bible does not and cannot say anything about contemporary LGBTQIA plus people. Often when particularly conservative churches talk about interpreting the Bible, they say that we should interpret the Bible in the original language or from the original language. But they leave out the original context. We need to look at the Bible. We need to look at our sacred text in Christianity, at least, from both the original language, but also the original context. What would have this passage meant to someone at the time that it was written? There's a great meme that's going around social media right now that I want to reference. Think about this. Think about that in 2,000 years, when people are looking at our language now in 2024 in the United States, The difference between butt dial and booty call will be lost on everyone. The same is true in many respects of the Bible. Simply put, language is contextual. So when we don't look at that context, when we ignore that context, when we don't give it the same weight as the original language, we run the risk, and we usually do, interpret it incorrectly. So for example, when Leviticus is talking about man shall not lie with another man, it's an abomination, they shall be put to death, their blood is on their hands, etc., etc. What they're referring to is not just two men having sexual relations. What's being referred to is exploitive and often violent sexual conduct. It's the idea that a conquering army, a conquering people would emasculate and I'm losing my train of thought, would emasculate and would, I'm totally losing my train of thought of the word I want, but would cause disrespect to come to another man by penetrating them, by taking the part, by making them into the quote unquote part of the woman. That is very different than a loving covenantal relationship between two men or two women. So throughout the Bible, these passages that have been used to marginalize the queer community, when understood in their correct context, show that they are very different than how they're being applied to queer relationships, again, in 2024. The other part of this is many of the terms we use, many of our understandings of being queer, of being gay, of being lesbian, etc., are based on research that was being done from about the mid-19th century onward, continuing really to today. So the Bible, being written, 1,800 years before, cannot comment on, cannot talk about our contemporary understanding of, again, loving, positive relationships, positive thoughts about who we are and our bodies. LGBTQIA plus Christians often struggle to find faith communities, even within affirming denominations. Affirming congregations can be hard to find, particularly in rural areas, but also in suburban and urban areas. As a shameless plug for my own org, Love Boldly maintains a list of affirming churches here in Ohio. If you happen to go over and take a look at that list, and you see any churches that you know are affirming or you think are affirming that aren't there, please let us know. We know that our list is not totally complete. It is a living document that is often being updated as often as we hear about churches that have become affirming or have always been affirming that we didn't know about. Even in individual congregations within otherwise affirming denominations, it does not always mean that those congregations will be affirming. With the possibility of one denomination in Christianity, at least here in the US, every denomination, even if it is affirming, often will have congregations that essentially opt out of being affirming or have not put in as much work to be affirming as other congregations. One of the things we also find when we talk about affirming congregations or not affirming congregations is that the congregations which have done significant work to be affirming of lesbian, gay, and bisexual or pansexual people sometimes have not done a similar amount of work to be welcoming and affirming to transgender and non-binary people. Love Boldly, for instance, has begun over the last few years to put significant resources and time into working with churches to be more accepting, more welcoming, more inclusive to transgender and non-binary people. And Geneva, I'm going to pause for just a second and realize that my presenter view is covering the chat. So if anyone is putting questions in, could you help me capture those or make sure that we get back to them at the end?
Sure, there aren't any questions yet,
Awesome.
but I'll let you know.
Thank you. So some folks on the call may have heard some of these terms that are on the screen now. I want to go over just a little bit of the jargon that has built up around queer people in the church. You sometimes hear people talk about side A, side B, side C, side X. You may have heard people talk about, including myself, affirming, welcoming but not affirming, third way, change, other words. Side A and affirming roughly are the same thing. A side A Christian or a side A church or denomination is said to be affirming. In a very general sense, that means that the church is welcoming overall to queer people. It allows queer people to participate in all ministries for which they're otherwise qualified. It allows same-gendered couples to marry in its congregation or in its building, on its grounds, with its clergy. And depending on how each denomination or church goes about ordaining, rostering, fellowshipping, confirming ministers, ordained clergy, will allow those people, will allow LGBTQIA plus people to be ordained. Side B is roughly the same as welcoming but not affirming. Side B churches typically take the approach of it is not a sin to be queer, it is a sin to act on your desires, to act on your attractions or whatever. Welcoming but not affirming churches or side B churches typically will allow queer people to be members, but they often put restrictions on what those queer people can do, what ministries they can serve in. They typically will not ordain queer people. They will typically not include for membership queer couples, but will include single queer people. Often inside B churches, queer people, particularly gay, lesbian, bisexual folks, are asked to either remain celibate or to marry someone of a different gender, specifically in a binary system, the quote-unquote opposite gender. Side C, or third way, is an approach to controversial topics using the idea that as long as we as a community can agree on certain essential parts of our faith, for example, Jesus being born of a virgin, living a sinless life, dying for our sins, and coming back on the third day. As long as we, for example, could agree on those things, then a third way approach says we should be able to disagree on non-essentials. When a third way approach is applied to theology, to philosophy, to any other thing that people might agree on or disagree on in a church community or just a community in general, when it's applied to these sort of esoteric, non-personal, non-grounded ideas, it's actually kind of an interesting way of approaching conflict. So, we have one person who says that at the Eucharist, the bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ. We have someone else in the same community who says it's still just bread and wine. We should be able to disagree about these things without hurting our community. That's a third way approach. The problem with third way is when it's applied to people. Imagine a congregation that says, yes, we are totally welcoming of LGBTQ people. We just don't talk about it all that much. That's problem number one. The second problem is, how could I, as a queer person who wants to be out, be expected to be in a community where some people are affirming and say, yeah, you're God made you, God loves you, no questions. While there are other people in the very same congregation saying, no, you are inherently sinful just by being gay, and you're going to hell. This is where the third way or the side C approach breaks down. My own congregation, Blue Ocean Faith Columbus, used to be part of a network of churches that took a third way approach. That network of churches, unfortunately, dissolved after about 10 years, if even that, because again, third way only works when we're talking about ideas. It is very problematic when we talk about people. The last side of this jargon is side X. The X comes from the idea of being an ex-gay. Side X churches, side X people require that LGBTQIA plus people change their sexual orientation. And to do that through reparative or conversion therapy, praying the gay away, so to speak. We'll talk more about sexual orientation change efforts in a moment, but side X are the churches that say you are inherently sinful for being queer, therefore you must change. I will say it now and I'll say it again in a few slides. One cannot change their sexual orientation. One can repress their sexual desires. One can marry the right person, be celibate, etc. One can't change their sexual orientation. Much of the philosophy and the quote unquote science that side X churches promote is at best junk science. Okay. We're going to move on to the second part of this presentation, looking at violence and the LGBTQIA plus community broadly, not just within the church. We'll get there in the third part. I do want to say this part of the presentation relies quite a bit more on statistics and facts drawn from a number of studies conducted by university scholars, as well as some LGBTQIA plus organizations. I believe that we'll have some way of being able to share out my slide deck. At the end of the deck, there are a few pages of references, and you can find the studies I'm going to be quoting there. So first off, thinking about overall violence and expectations for the queer community. Often we hear people talk about the queer agenda or the gay agenda. I'm here to tell you that the real queer agenda is to live for as long as we can, as authentically as we can. And I say for as long as we can, because in 2024, there was a study conducted specifically of LGBTQIA plus youth, which found that 36% of those youth reported having a low expectation of living to be 35. 36% LGBTQIA plus youth reported having a low expectation of actually living to be 35. And that was based on the overall climate for the queer community here in the United States, both from what is being passed at the state and federal levels, and also the climate of violence and of threats to our community. There was a great study done by the Trevor Project, which is an organization that mostly works with queer youth. They did a study of surveying well over 28,000 LGBTQIA plus youth. The study, I believe, was conducted in 2023, with the findings reflecting 2022. 41% of the youth in that study reported seriously considering attempting suicide within the previous year. 14% of youth in the study reported that they had attempted suicide in that previous year. Again, based on the climate of threats and of violence targeting the queer community. Now, one of the first times that violence really impacts members of the queer community is at home. Imagine a person of any age telling their parents or caregivers or siblings or uncles and aunts or whoever that they are LGBTQIA+. What happens next will have a major impact on the life and the health of this person. When I did my doctoral dissertation, I was studying LGBTQIA+ leaders in Christianity. And one of the people I interviewed didn't come out until he was well into his 50s, if not even around the age of 60. He came out after his wife had passed away. They had raised, I believe, 4 children. And the people that he was the most nervous about coming out to, were not his friends who he had known his whole life. They weren't business contacts. They weren't people at church. It was his children. And he was really convinced that his children wouldn't accept him. And even though he was an adult who could more than live on his own and had been doing so for a while, and then with his wife, it was still that family, the closest family members to him, that he was most nervous about coming out to. Thankfully, his children were fine, and I think he thought that a few of them had already sort of figured it out. But again, whatever age a queer person is at when they come out, one of the most important parts is how they are received or how they are rejected by their closest family members. And for queer youth, how they're received at home. Unfortunately, rejection, condemnation, and negative messages remain a far too common experience for LGBTQIA+ people, particularly children and teens. Overall, LGBTQIA+ youth experience lower levels of parental closeness and increased levels of parental abuse and homelessness. Less than 40% of LGBTQ+ youth in the study from the Trevor Project felt that their home was affirming. LGBTQIA+ youth with at least one affirming adult in their life, not one affirming parent, not one affirming relative, one affirming adult of any sort, coaches, teachers, mentors, whoever, are less likely, usually less likely by almost 50%, to either experience suicidal ideation or to attempt suicide. Homelessness and poverty. I want to say, for the record, I believe that homelessness and poverty, particularly in a nation that builds itself as the greatest in the world, is a form of violence. The single greatest contributor to homelessness for LGBTQIA+ people is family rejection. This goes right back to what we were just discussing. In a national study, 17% of LGBTQIA+ people responded that they have experienced homelessness at some point over the course of their lives, compared to 6% among straight cisgender people. Approximately 8% of transgender adults have experienced homelessness within the last year. While LGBTQIA+ youth are estimated to be about 7 to 9% of the population, of the general population, they account for 30% of all youth experiencing homelessness. That said, these rates were even still higher among transgender and non-binary youth. In fact, almost 25%, 1/4 of transgender people between the ages of 18 and 25 are currently experiencing homelessness. And probably that number is even greater when we take into account people who were not counted in studies. While poverty across all groups in the LGBTQIA+ community dropped significantly during the COVID-19 pandemic, queer people are still more likely to experience homelessness and poverty than their cisgender heterosexual peers. A report from the Williams Institute at UCLA Law School in 2021 stated that 17% of queer people lived in poverty compared to 12% of the general population. In that same study, 21% of transgender people were found to live in poverty as of 2021. So now moving on to direct threats and harassment of queer people. Unfortunately, for many queer people, myself included, we have accepted that part of our lives as out queer people is going to involve threats and harassment. Approximately 3 in 4, or 75% of all queer people, have reported being threatened or harassed just in the last year. In the study from the Trevor Project, LGBTQIA plus youth surveyed, the majority of those youth surveyed reported being harassed at school. And it should be noted that when we talk about the harassment of LGBTQIA plus youth at school, we are unfortunately not just talking about peer-to-peer harassment or peer-to-peer threats. We are talking about threats and harassment targeting queer children by staff, faculty, administrators, and others. Threats against the LGBTQIA plus community spiked during the summer of 2023 and have since declined throughout 2024, but remain high. This overall climate of threats and harassment contributes to the high prevalence of suicidal ideation and attempted suicides within the queer community. But we also need to be careful that when we talk about threats and harassment against the queer community, we are not only talking about threats or harassment coming from bad actors, coming from people in one's community, from one's family, from one's school, etc. The LGBTQA plus community is currently being targeted by almost every state government in this country, as well as the federal government. And while some laws that have been passed, have been proposed, have been considered, particularly in state houses around the country, may not target the entirety of the queer community, it creates not just a chilling effect, it creates an almost all-out war effect on the queer community. So moving on to physical and sexual violence. Members of the queer community are 4 times more likely to be victims of physical violence, including rape, sexual assault, aggravated assault, and simple assault, compared to their cisgender and heterosexual peers. LGBTQIA people are also 6 times more likely to experience violence from someone they know, 6 times more likely from someone they know, and 2.5 times more likely to experience violence from a stranger. And in what has to be, I think, possibly one of the worst statistics I've ever come across, in the Trevor Project study in 2023, where they had sampled over 28,000 queer youth, they found among LGBTQIA plus adolescents between the ages of 13 and 18, almost 50%, 49%, reported being sexually assaulted at least once in the previous year. 49% of over 28,000 LGBTQIA plus youth reporting to the Trevor Project that they were sexually assaulted at least once in the previous year, which compared to surveys of all 13 to 18-year-olds in the US, I said that incorrectly, compared to only 11% in all 13 to 18-year-olds in the US. Okay, having looked at the church and the queer community, as well as violence targeting the queer community, I want to now turn to looking at LGBTQIA plus people, church trauma, and church violence. Now, just by the way of a few additional statistics, researchers found that despite significant trauma, violence, rejection, condemnation, LGBTQIA plus people remain religious or interested in being religious at high rates. Approximately 55% of LGBTQIA plus people identify with a religious tradition or spirituality, not just Christianity. And of those 55%, approximately 33% of those queer people identify as Christian. In 2016, the researcher and author Andrew Marin conducted a study of people who were raised in Christian churches across denominations, and who then at some point had left those denominations, those traditions, either to explore other religions or simply not to attend a place of worship. Marin found that among LGBTQIA plus people, 76% reported that if they could find a church that affirmed their identities and the identities of the people that they cared about, they would return to church. Now, obviously, they weren't saying they would go back to the church that they had been raised in, but they would go back to some church, some expression of Christianity, Christ following, etc. But Marin found among the population as a whole, only 9% of people said that they would return to church. So one of the first places that many LGBTQIA plus Christians experience violence, experience threats, is from sermons and messages. Unfortunately, in many places, even among otherwise well-intentioned clergy, sermons preached by clergy often include negative messages or misinformation about the queer community and about how queer people need to or have to be part of the community. Well-intentioned clergy, leaders, and others often use the phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin. Now, I would argue categorically that God made us queer. Hard stop. And that God loves us having made us queer and celebrates us having made us queer. But that aside for the moment, this phrase, love the sinner, hate the sin, is almost always applied to the queer community and rarely applied to supposedly other sins. Even among some of the strictest denominations and churches and traditions around sexual ethics, the standard by which, or the standard that is applied to the queer community, is often inconsistently applied to other communities. Imagine a completely fictitious, but based in some truth. Imagine this situation. On one Friday night, both Elder A and Elder B, who, by the way, are both men who are leaders in their church, are both seen at a seedy motel with people who are not their wives. Elder A is with a woman, Elder B is with a man. Subsequently, they're called in front of their fellow elders and in front of the pastor. Elder A is admonished for his behavior. He is instructed that he must seek counseling along with his wife immediately and to never let it happen again. He's told at the end of his meeting that, assuming that he does what he was told, he will be welcomed back at the next elders meeting. Elder B is then called in. Elder B is the one who was seen with a man. Elder B is called before the other elders. He's told, however, that not only is he being permanently removed from the elders board, he and his whole family are being excommunicated and expelled from the congregation. He's also given the name of a therapist who can help people like him. Again, while this is a fictitious situation, we see this time and again. We see levels of sexual standards and sexual ethics applied much more harshly, much more concretely to queer people than we do see them applied to heterosexual folks or folks who are presumed to be heterosexual. And this goes for both adults as well as youth. One of the other people I interviewed in my dissertation reported how she went away to a summer camp that was for mostly musical and other artistic youth. She made great friends, many of whom were already out and very proud about their queer identities. She was in the closet, but kind of assumed that, her new friends kind of knew what was going on. When she got back to her hometown, she had a meeting with her youth director at church who said, she told everything that had happened, how much fun she had had, and she mentioned that she had this great group of new friends who were all queer. The youth minister told her, you have to cut contact with these people. They're not a good influence. They're not doing what God wants for them. And when she pushed back and said, they're just new friends. I mean, they're cool people, whatever. I'm not like, doing things with them. The youth minister said that if he found out that she had not cut contact with them, that she would no longer be allowed to participate in church ministries, including being part of the band, being part of the choir, things that were very, very much or very important to her. Even as a youth, even as a person in high school for her at that time, there was the requirement that she break tie with anyone who was out and queer. And that brings us to our next point, mandates and requirements. Obviously, LGBTQIA plus people come out in conservative churches, in evangelical fundamentalist churches. But when that happens, or when a queer person joins one of these more conservative churches, they are often subjected to mandates and requirements that are simply not imposed on other people. On perhaps the lesser end of this spectrum, when LGBTQIA plus couples attend conservative churches, they are many times and almost invariably asked not to hold hands, not to exchange affection with their partner, etc. More often than not, though, we're talking about single queer people attending these churches or coming out in these churches, or at least attending them without their partner. So for many single queer Christians in more conservative churches, they are simply asked to be celibate. They're asked not to express anything about being queer. Actually, in many cases, they're told not to use the word queer or gay or lesbian or bisexual, but rather to say that they are struggling with same-sex attraction. There is an entire community that has been built up, particularly here in the US, but also globally, of celibate queer Christians who are trying to navigate how to remain faithful to what they believe God is calling them to do, while also being as authentic as possible about who they are as queer people. One of the things that makes this harder is that, particularly in evangelicalism, there's not a great understanding of an idea of being called to be single. One is often thought to be called to be married, and then called to other things as well by God. The idea of committed singleness really only shows up among Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox traditions. Most queer people in non-affirming churches are also therefore excluded from ministry. If a person who is already ordained or rostered as a minister comes out, they often lose their position, if not their ordination as well. Often queer people are restricted from many types of ministries in conservative churches, whether that be service in the choir, working with youth, serving on church boards, etc. That being said, there are celibate queer Christians out there who often are honored, who are given a real platform in evangelical churches because they've committed to celibacy and are following exactly what their church is telling them to do. So, like I said earlier, sexual orientation change efforts, or SOCIs, including conversion or reparative therapy. I'm putting therapy in quotes because conversion or reparative therapy, at best, is using therapeutic ideas to promote something that is not scientific or therapeutic. At worst, conversion or reparative therapy is frankly torture. But conversion or reparative therapy is really any combination of prayer, biblical counseling, pastoral counseling, talk therapy, behavioral modification, electric shock therapy, and all kinds of other interventions. It often relies on prayer and faith in God to heal a person, quote unquote. The idea being that if you just have enough faith in God, if you just pray enough, then God will take away this queerness, this homosexuality that you're feeling. Unfortunately, much of these efforts don't stop at people who are queer. We see this show up, particularly in the evangelical tradition, among using prayer and faith and trust in God to, again, quote unquote, heal or cure a person of other things determined to be mental illnesses, such as anxiety and depression. Quite often, socies, particularly conversion or reparative therapy, embrace toxic versions of gender identity. What's the way to quote unquote cure someone who's a lesbian? Make her wear a dress and be very dainty and submissive and quiet and blah, blah, blah. What's the best way to quote unquote heal a gay man? Is to make him run around and be really rough and tough with other men. These quote unquote therapies really embrace a very toxic idea of what it means to be a man, to be a woman, to be a person in general. Across the whole queer community, at least 20% of queer people have been exposed or directly impacted by some version of quote unquote conversion therapy. In a separate report by the Trevor Project, they found that 10% of LGBTQIA plus youth, and this is within the last few years, reported being threatened with conversion therapy, and an additional 5% of queer youth reported being subjected to conversion therapy. Now, those numbers are lower in this generation for a number of reasons. First, even the people who have peddled conversion therapy, for example, Exodus International and some of those groups that were very active, particularly in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, have themselves admitted that they probably didn't change anyone's sexual orientation, that it's really not possible to do. All they did is help people or force people to repress their desires. Conversion therapy has also been banned or restricted in several countries. And in 2020, it was listed by the United Nations as a form of torture. In the United States, 27 states have banned conversion therapy. I'm sorry to say Ohio is not one of those, but 12 larger cities in Ohio, including Columbus, Cincinnati, and Cleveland, have banned the practice within their borders. It is also becoming more and more understood that conversion or reparative therapy is at best junk science. I would argue that there is more scientific rigor in the study of Bigfoot or aliens than there is in conversion therapy. And again, we come back to rejection and loss of community, almost exactly where we started. Often LGBTQIA plus folks who come out in conservative churches are expelled or excommunicated from those communities. Sometimes, in some cases, many times, their families, their friends, and other people in their lives are told to cut all contact with them. This can be at the same time that they're losing contact with family and friends. It can, in some cases, be after their parents have initially, or their family has initially supported them. And this loss of community, this loss of church community, has so many different impacts that just ripple out when it happens. Not only is the loss of one's community and in some ways their connection with the divine, but it is also in many cases the loss of their, outside of their family, their real support system. Growing up as a Roman Catholic, I remember that my doctor, my dentist, most of my friends, most of my parents' friends, most of my sister's friends were all drawn from our church. Why? Because we spent a huge amount of time in that community. It wasn't just that, we isolated ourselves in that community. We simply just spent a lot of time there. My parents invested a lot of their time in that congregation. And hence, that was our community in many ways greater than our local community or other communities that we were also part of. There are reports, there are studies that have indicated that children as young as 7 have been rejected, abandoned, and excommunicated from their churches for either being LGBTQIA plus or being presumed to be. Now, I want to leave this discussion on what I consider to be the greatest violence committed by churches against the LGBTQIA plus community. And if I get a little emotional while I talk about this, it's because in my own story, this pops up as well. What often happens when someone comes out, particularly in a conservative environment, or a conservative religious environment, they are presented with this idea that God loves them and God wants to see them be straight or non-LGBTQIA plus, that their home community, that their friends from back home, their family, their ministers, their whoever, love them so much that they're not going to let them be queer. When I came out, I was a sophomore in college attending a Protestant institution. Again, raised Catholic. Everyone I knew back home was pretty much Catholic, and I had attended Catholic schools throughout my education. I remember people emailing, calling, talking to me when I went home about how they loved me so much that they didn't want to see me be queer. That they knew in their heart of hearts that God loved me so much that God was going to solve this queer problem for me. And what it set up for me and for many other queer people is it made love a tension. It made love, it essentially weaponized love against the person who I now truly believe God created me to be. We unfortunately see this time and again. We see churches using the language of love, using love itself to target and force young queer people and queer people of all ages to embrace something that is not authentic, that is not God-given. At least I would argue. And again, it simply makes love a tension. For some people, myself included, who had a very supportive family, who was in a supportive community that said, yeah, that's not what God wants. That's not who you were made to be. I was able to navigate that very well. For people who have lost family members, whose family won't talk to them, whose family are just using this weaponization of love, it can literally be devastating to the point of reinforcing what we have seen among queer youth and queer people in general about rates of suicidal ideation, suicide attempts, and unfortunately death by suicide. So I end on that note. I would love to take questions from anyone. Before I do, I just want to say, again, thank you all for having me. Some of my contact information is here, my email through Love Boldly, our Love Boldly website, our Bluish and Faith Columbus website, as well as my own website. Again, I'm happy to take questions now, but I would also be happy to respond to questions via email or other means. And I'm going to stop sharing so that hopefully we can have a bit of a conversation.
Thank you so much, Ben. And I am happy to send your slides out to everyone who registered. He mentioned that. So now we're going to open for questions. If you have a question, please feel free to unmute yourself and ask directly, or you can put it in the chat if you're more comfortable. I did receive one question about how we should respond if we receive harassment and threats.
Sure. Well, first up, I think it depends on what the content and tenor of those threats are. Anyone who I'm one of those people, particularly as a big white guy, I am one of those people who's like, okay, bring the threats on. Come on, what are you going to do? That's not the best way to handle things, particularly when threats become threats of physical violence, threats of death threats. Those should definitely be reported to, at the very minimum, your local police department. Um, I would also argue that those should be reported to whatever your regional office is of either the U.S. Department of Justice or of the FBI. The FBI, at least in recent years, has done a very good job of monitoring threats, of documenting them. And even if they can't form a case against someone, or they can't figure out who the person was, or who left the message, sent the email, the whatever, they have done a very good job of responding to threats, particularly threats against the queer community. I think 1 or 2 years ago now, La Boldly received kind of a general death threat of someone who, using very biblical language, wanted to hurt all of us. And within a few days of reporting it to our local FBI office, I was meeting in person with 2 FBI agents who were taking this very seriously. So again, receiving threats, particularly threats of physical violence or of death, report them to your local police office, report them to your local DOJ or FBI office as well, if possible. And also, of course, take care of yourself. It can be incredibly isolating. It can be incredibly scary to receive any sort of threat, even if it's not a threat that you are personally worried about it happening, but you're just receiving it in general. So definitely take time for yourself and use whatever resources you have at your disposal to be able to process through that sort of threat or that occurrence.
Dayon, I see you have your hand up.
Hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
All right, perfect.
Yes.
So, hi, my name is Deion Brown. I'm actually the president of the Common Ground RSO organization at UNLV. It's the organization that I had started from pretty much the ground up. And I've been working very closely with Professor Gard Jameson and Roberta Sabbath and others here at the Interfaith Council Center, Alita. But here in Nevada, particularly, my thing is more of a just more of an acknowledgement rather than a question. I've been very closely related to the LGBTQIA community. It's something that's very near and dear to my heart. I'm sorry I came in a little bit late today. I'm at work. Why I'm not on video via HIPAA laws, but I just wanted to just kind of share a little bit that the story that Reverend Ben had mentioned that about even though he said he grew up in a Catholic environment, but attending like a Protestant university, or was it seminary or?
It was college, undergraduate.
Okay. Okay, yeah. So I was raised Protestant, but it was very much more like very strict Protestant, borderline evangelicalism, fundamentalist, nationalist, doomsday preppers, all that fun stuff. So so sharing your story and you saying that how it makes you emotional, it actually made me emotional hearing it too, because I am bisexual. And so growing up in that environment, in that community, and that, that I think it's more harmful in the sense to say, I love you so much that I want to do everything I can to save your soul, to change who you are. And there's just so much identity crisis. I think that it's actually more damaging, because it's almost like because hate comes from ignorance and fear. So when people are so engulfed in their hate and their fear, it's something that it can be unlearned. Like it with information, with love and compassion, and just resources, and eventually those people can change. I think that it's harder to change someone's ideology when they are in this belief system. I feel like a very cult-like mentality, that they are that they love you, that they identify that love as something that they have to do. Like it's an obligation by God to change who you are. And, I experienced, with my growing up, that we had to disown our family members because they were Catholic. And right, exactly. Because anybody outside of our little close-knit group was considered to be pagan. So it was, but yeah, so it's just that I just wanted to kind of just acknowledge what you were saying, and just kind of say that, like, even though we all have like different stories, it's a very common sense of feeling. And so coming out of all of this, I guess what I would say is, going forward, especially for my organization, what would you like recommend during this time of like uncertainty and fear? What are some good like resources that we can help to not necessarily change people's mind, but just show people through love and compassion, and what are ways that we can do that?
Sure. Thank you so much for sharing part of your story. And thank you for that great question. I think there's a few pieces that I point to. I think one thing we have to do, both individually and collectively, is continue to live and be who we are. Continue to represent that, we believe that, in a religious sense, we believe that God made us queer, loves us just as we are, and be consistent with that, even if it does cause some tension, some conflict. But be clear that we are not going to move away from that position, that we're not going to give up that position, that this is really what we believe, and it's how we are looking at the kind of the same picture, but seeing something differently. There are some wonderful organizations that are out there doing pieces or whole of this work. Particularly in speaking to folks who are from the more conservative or the more evangelical fundamentalist side of Christianity. One excellent organization that I can point to is Making Things Right, Brian Neitzel's organization, which is out of Georgia. Peter Volk, who I admit that I don't agree with on many things, but occasionally find myself agreeing with, is working out of Nashville, Tennessee, on an organization called Equip. I will be very clear that these are both organizations that, again, I disagree with, but they speak very well to people who are just recently coming out of a kind of evangelical background, or who are still in that background, either want to be there or are struggling to find ways to move to other parts of the church. And they do very well, particularly Peter's organization does a very good job of speaking in terms, not speaking, I don't want to say speaking in terms that evangelicals understand, but using the language of evangelicalism to say, queer people are here, we are loved by God, and we need support from people, whether you're queer or not, whether you're evangelical or not, even Christian or not. But again, I come back to, I know it's a cliche, but we have to continue to live our truth. We have to be able, as much as we can, as much as we're comfortable and safe to do, to continue to say, this is what I believe, this is why I believe it. And, I'm not going to go back, but I'm so willing to have that conversation with you. I hope that at least began to answer the question. I'd love to continue that conversation.
I think that your response was absolutely beautiful. I really appreciate that. And I would definitely like to talk to you a little bit more outside of this meeting here, because I think that I can learn a lot from you and share some more stories here. So I really appreciate your input, and thank you for being here. I really appreciate it.
Definitely. Thank you.
I saw that Mark had their hand up. Did you still have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to say, obviously, Ben, thanks so much for this conversation. This is such an amazing presentation. One of the questions that I had was in regards to, I guess, experiencing these kind of situations in a public setting. I was reading, Envy's work, their post on Grove City Pride, what happens, and that really just shook me just thinking about that and what happened in that situation. And I wonder, for people like myself and maybe other people as well who may not be as, I guess, confrontational when it comes to those kind of situations, how we should respond to those moments, especially when we're in a public setting. There's people that are kids and their families, and those of us who do work in nonprofits and or activists. How should we respond to those situations where not as confrontational?
Totally. Thank you. Before I answer that question, I just want to acknowledge Mark is actually a friend of mine and also a member of our Love Boldly board, who I'm thinking by what's popping up in your picture might be signed in on the Love Boldly account. And in Mark's question, he's referring to an incident that happened in Grove City, Ohio at their Pride Festival just a few weeks ago, where a group of bad actors showed up, tried to protest, and were met with a peaceful counter protest from people who were there. First off, whenever we have bad actors or others who show up to a Pride Festival or to, a drag story hour, or even sometimes to church services, one of the things we have to do is make sure that we are acting with our own safety and the safety of the group in mind. In the Grove City scenario, the organizers and some of the vendors and groups that were there simply formed a line and visually blocked out, and with music audibly blocked out what these people were saying, what they were doing, the symbols and hand signs and salutes that they were making. That was the response in that moment. Responding to the fact that there were 10 of these bad actors at most there, and that they left pretty quickly. And they were never physically violent. But I think we each have to take into account, where are we, who are we with, who do we need to, whose needs do we need to respond to as well? This is kind of a situation, it's sort of like when you're on a plane and the flight attendant says to put on your mask first and then help people around you. It's the same idea. We need to take account of what's going on and how we can respond in the best way. Many people, including folks that were at the Love Boldly booth, immediately stepped up and joined that kind of like human wall around these protesters. Other folks could have helped with people who are even more scared or even more worried about what's going on. Helping to get either the organizers of the event or security, law enforcement, whoever, aware that this is going on. There are many different ways that people can respond in those moments and after the fact. Just like Envy Gay, who's one of our other board members who was there and wrote a wonderful op-ed about it. She wrote in to a paper to express her feelings and emotions. Other people responded in other ways after the fact as well. But it really, particularly in the moment, it really has to start by how do we feel safe? How do we feel comfortable responding? And we're the only ones who can make that determination for ourselves. And sometimes, particularly if this had been, a much more vocal protest, one that kept going on, one that became confrontational, even potentially became physical, it would have been perfectly fine for people to say, I can't be here, I don't feel safe, I need to move away. Whereas others may have made the choice to stay and try to diffuse the situation. But I think it has to come back, Mark, and everyone to what do we feel safe doing? What can we do? And sometimes it also means, for those of us who tend to be a little bit more hot-headed, me included, it also means taking that breath, taking that step back and saying, okay, if I go up there, I'm liable to say something to these people, and it's not going to be helpful. So we have to take stock of who we are, what we feel comfortable doing, what we feel safe doing.
Thank you.
We have another question in the chat. I think it was sent directly to me from Bruce. What are your thoughts regarding Christian theology around transgenderism? Churches who are affirming, like ours, wrestle with the idea that God created me this way when someone decides to go through transition surgeries. So did God make a mistake in giving them the wrong body? These are the areas that are a stretch for our congregation.
Yep. And Bruce, your congregation would not be alone by any means in that. I like to think of it this way. Most transgender folks, when they talk about their gender identity, will often say, I have been a woman, I have been a man, I have been whatever other gender my entire life. Whether or not I presented in that way, whether or not my anatomy, my physique, my whatever aligned with that gender, perhaps, is immaterial to the fact that I have always been this gender. I think that sort of understanding is where I understand how God creates transgender people, even though in some part of their life, they will choose to medically transition. I think we can also, though I'm not sure this is helpful, we can also think of it in the sense of believing that God had a purpose in placing that person in a body that would not inevitably or eventually align with their gender identity. I realize that neither of those answers is probably all that helpful, and probably stops far short of the questions that initial question raises. Again, I continue to struggle with that too. And I admit that as someone who is cisgender, who's not transgender, I have no life experience or lived experience to be able to offer a good or what I feel is a sufficient response to that question. I would point folks though, do I have the book near me? I don't think so. There is the Transmission Collective, is a ministry collective that works particularly with trans Christians. Austin Harkey, that's his name. Austin Harkey is a Christian writer, progressive Christian writer, trans man himself, and who has done significant work around theology and the transgender experience. I would point people to his work first and foremost, is probably one of the top sources for transgender, for what I guess we could call transgender theology, as a subset of queer theology. There are other theologians, particularly queer theologians, who have worked on the same topic. But Austin's work is probably the best because, again, it combines his own experience along with the theological and personal reflection. Also, if anyone's curious a little bit more broadly, Austin documented his medical transition via YouTube videos over the course of 2 or 3 years. Those videos are still available, I believe, on YouTube. Whether or not you want to watch the whole thing is, your call, but just watching some of them along the way gives a really, really interesting and very personal perspective on a transgender person going through a transition process.
Deion, you have your hand up again.
Yes, actually, I wanted to add into this. This is actually a very even closer topic to me because I have spent a lot of time in researching and doing papers and research papers and stuff over the years for this particular topic. Maybe not so much with in regards to religion, but more on the scientific aspect. So one of the things that I would definitely say is that we're still learning, like biologically, that there is a difference in the binary, and it's not as cut clear as we've been raised. And I think that a lot of people try to hide behind religion to express their feelings towards something that they don't understand. And so one thing that we can do with science is learn more about gender and sex and the biology that makes the complex humans that we are. And I think that it is less of, I think that over the years, we've kind of more focused on the religious aspect of it rather than what it actually means to be, in that position, in that body. And so I think that we need to look at it from a very empathetic, standpoint, because, these are people that are suffering with their identity and something that they cannot explain. And all that they hear is this, these stereotypes and rhetoric that is, brought to them from their beliefs and, or the beliefs of the people around them. And it's a very lonely place to be. But in the context, when we add the religion aspect to being LGBTQIA plus, especially in this situation, being a transgender person, I'll link the book in the chat, but it is called Beyond a Binary God. And it's a theology for trans allies. It's definitely kind of goes more into the religious aspect of understanding someone who is transgender and or non-binary. And so I think that book was very wonderful, very enlightening. And we also have to put into perspective that the concept of gender and concept of transgenderism, it's not something that's new. This is very ancient. This has been since the beginning of time. And a lot of with colonization and, there's been this push to think of it as bad. So now we think of it as, but when we look at the two spirits in Native American and indigenous cultures, it is something that is honored and reflected. Or we have in India, which is one of the oldest surviving religions out there, Hinduism. And so I forget the name of them, but it's and even within like the deities within Hinduism, there's this reflection of non-binary and binary, so it just goes to show that it's much more deeper than just black and white and what we see in the biblical text or in religious text today. It's been around since the beginning of time. And so I think that our responsibility is to just be there for people and to keep the science going, and separating it from religion, but also at the same time educating those who are religious on these topics.
That was said much better than what I said.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Deion. Are there any final questions? I know we are already about 20 minutes past the hour, 23 minutes past the hour. Checking the chat really quickly. Oh, I do see one more question that I missed. What should the role of the church be in addressing, this says this situation, but I'm presuming homophobia and transphobia?
Sure. The church, at least in my opinion, and I'm going to speak only for my opinion, but the church has perpetrated so much harm against the queer community, and I'm using church there very broadly. It needs to be the church. It needs to be Christians ourselves, all of us, who are stepping up to reconcile with and work and better work with the queer community and making the church a better and more welcoming place, more affirming place for all folks, not just queer folks. The church has done harm to many marginalized communities or has helped both the US as well as other nations do harm to many marginalized communities. So it is us, the church, it is us, Christ followers, Christians, etc., who need to be the ones working to fix and to reconcile what has been done incorrectly in the past.
Okay, well, I think those are all the questions that I see, and I think a lot of people had to leave a bit earlier. So I just want to thank everyone who stayed around for the discussion. This was wonderful. Thank you so much to Reverend Dr. Hillscamp for your time and for this wonderful presentation. I will forward the recording and your slides and any other information that you want like me to share with the participants. You could email it to me. I'll make sure out to everyone. And if there's any final thoughts you had that you would.
No, again, I just want to thank everyone for being part of this presentation and this call. Particularly thank you to Geneva and the other folks at the Interfaith Center. I definitely appreciate this this opportunity and this invitation. And again, I have just dropped my email, Love Boldly's website, my personal website in the chat. Feel free to reach out. I am more than happy to correspond over email or set up other times to speak to folks.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all so much, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us.